to pruning, we do have, today is the second to the last lecture, so Friday will be the last one, but then there is the optional in-person pruning workshop on Saturday. So that'll be the 11th. If you want to, basically, I mean, I feel like particularly pruning is really helpful in person along with irrigation, but there's just a lot of photos in this lecture. And of course, you can't really get the three-dimensional vibe or view of a tree when we're looking at some of these photos. So I think the in-person one can be really helpful.
What time is that class?
There's 2 times for it, and I believe there's 8:30 and either 10 or 11:30 there, but there's 2 time slots.
So do you have to register or just show up?
No, you have to register. On the first email that Brenda sent out to you guys that has like the link to the workbook and has the schedule for the classes, there is 2 Eventbrite links for basically signing up for the classes. So find that email back from the beginning, and there is the Eventbrites, the 2 links for those. In fact, I'm not sure, she might have sent another one, but definitely It's on that first one. Okay.
I only sent it once saying to keep this email, but I'll post it again. I'll post it again right now in the chat for everyone that needs it. So thank you for that reminder, Claire.
Cool.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. And like I said, if you guys can go to it, highly recommend it. I think it really is a good additional companion to the actual lecture part. Okay, well, I'm just going to get into pruning then, because I know I kind of go over on this lecture usually. So we will talk about the reasons for pruning, and then many of the different techniques, like what we call different pruning techniques. And we'll talk a little bit about the seasons that you might prune. And we will at the end kind of go over specifically Ceanothus, manzanita, and sages, not in great detail, but again, I'll leave you with resources so you're not like totally empty-handed. And then we'll talk a little bit about tools in the lecture too. So starting with reasons to prune, there's kind of the main reasons would be just rejuvenation. So just wanting to rejuvenate the plant if you have an older plant, or just stimulate kind of like new growth on the plant. You really, if that's your aim, like I really need to stimulate new growth on this plant, then a reason would be rejuvenating the plant. It also might be removing unproductive or like really woody growth. That might be part of rejuvenation. Another reason would be aesthetics, which could be well, shaping falls into aesthetics too. I mean, honestly, you could have more than one reason for pruning. It could be aesthetics and plant health, or rejuvenation and plant health, whatever it might be. But in terms of aesthetics, usually you are shaping it in some way, like redirecting the growth, or maybe encouraging more laterals to develop. So laterals are kind of like the branches and twigs, side branches and twigs off of a main branch. So aesthetics might be, or sorry, shaping is when you're redirecting the growth in some way, or maybe you're like what's the word? De-invigorating, is that a word? But like maybe you're removing really vigorous growth that because you want to kind of move the growth more into another direction, or potentially make the plant more symmetrical or something like that. It's also just shaping can be like if you have more of a tree form and you want it to look more like a hedge, or vice versa, just shaping in general, like making it the shape you want it to be, or just accentuating its natural growth habit. So that's all kind of aesthetics. Plant health would be, they usually say like the 3 Ds. So that would be remove dead, diseased, or damaged vegetation. That is definitely for plant health, but also just could be aesthetics too. So the 4th D though is deranged. So any deranged branches, that meaning like any disoriented or crossed branches, would be you would remove those parts. You might want to prune those out, not well for health, because of course diseases you want removed, but damaged parts are just going to be like flailing bits of the plant that need to be cleaned up. So the 4 Ds would be dead, disease, damaged, and disoriented. Those you want to remove first, and then you can actually kind of like with those gone, you can kind of get a good look of the plant, and then I would move into shaping. But that being said, definitely want to remove those things first. Also, it might be for plant health, might also include removing limbs to add more light into the canopy. Maybe you want there to be more light or maybe more air circulation. Maybe you're just pruning it back because it's invading into other plants. Maybe it's about like size control because of your pruning for overcrowding that, you know, took place when they planted it. So plant health can be a lot of things. It can be like, you know, just spacing, air circulation, light, or just, you know, disease, actually removing diseased or damaged limbs. And then of course, there's always keeping branches and debris out of the pathways. That's always just like pruning that you might do just for, you know, movement throughout the garden. Okay, so ways to prune. We're going to talk about a couple different techniques for pruning, but I hope I say this a bunch of times because I want to remind myself and everyone that before you utilize a certain cut, we're going to talk about a bunch of different techniques of ways to prune, but before you utilize them, always have like an objective in mind that kind of goes back to have a reason for pruning. So am I doing this to rejuvenate it? Why am I doing this? Just because it's a type of pruning cut doesn't mean you have to use it in all scenarios with all plants or every year, you know. So it's just, again, always have an objective in mind in terms of what is it I want to achieve with this cut, or what do I want to achieve with this plant? Like, I just want to shape it so it's more symmetrical, or do I want to rejuvenate it? It's looking really old and shabby. And then we'll get into this when we get into the seasons, but it's very much going to depend on what kind of plant also in terms of what technique you use. Some techniques don't work as well for all, you know, all plants don't like every technique, I guess is the way I say it. And so yeah, the type of cut is kind of going to depend on what's your objective and what kind of plant are you talking about? What kind of plant are you trying to prune? And then in general, well, maybe I'll get to this later. Yeah, I think we'll get to this later. I'll just get into the different pruning techniques. So there is first deadheading, which is just removing any spent flower or spent flower clusters and doing that before the seeds mature. So it usually, if you're doing it before the seeds mature in certain plants, it can actually prolong the flowering season. Usually the ones that where if you're deadheading to prolong the flowering season, that's usually annuals or like non-woody perennials like Erigeron glauca or something that's maybe Enselias. Those ones you can potentially prolong the flowering season, but the woodier perennials typically it doesn't prolong the flowering season. It just gives them a kind of tidier look. So deadheading won't always prolong the flowering season. Again, it's going to depend on the plant. Not all plants respond the same way, but many of them will keep flowering longer if you remove the flower, and definitely if you remove the flower before the seeds mature. So like even in like a shrubby monkey flower, they actually flower from the bottom up. So these you have to keep your eye on the flowers low down, because those ones are the ones where the seeds are maturing. So if you keep removing those spent flowers out from below, you kind of keep getting flowers going upwards. So making sure that the seeds don't mature, otherwise kind of defeats the purpose, and the plant's like, oh, I set my seeds, so I don't need to keep flowering. So you have to kind of stay on top of it, at least with those plants that can do that. If it's a plant like this on the right, which is Eriogonum blisianum, it's a cross between Eriogonum arborescens and Eriogonum gigantum. And you can see it kind of has the arborescens leaves, and then it has the big gigantum flower clusters. And so in this case, it won't prolong the flowering season, but we have a lot of dried flowered clusters that you can just remove. And they've just been removed all the way back to where, like their origin here. And you can see on the right, it just kind of cleans it up. And of course, they've left the non-flowered kind of flower buds, I guess, the about to flower flowering clusters. And this one, and that's because this one blooms really late into the season. So you can leave these flower heads on as long as you want. And maybe if you want to keep it cleaned up, you do this kind of in winter or even spring. And that's probably why this one has some green flowers starting to bud up, because it's probably in spring. So you might have both new flowers and the old ones on a plant, and you can remove them for tidiness sake. There's also, so here's another example. This is Salvia clevelandii, which this is a whirly blue. And you can see just pre and post removing the dried seed heads. And of course, you can always remove the seed heads, but essentially they also are bird food. So a lot of our seed-eating birds really love having these dried seed heads on the plant. So it is kind of like measuring or balancing the client's desires with the look. So are aesthetics really important to them? They don't want anything dry and dead on their plant, or maybe they are really close to the wildland urban interface, and the more dead material on your plant means the more of a fire hazard it is. So if that's a concern, then maybe that outweighs the wildlife habitat thing. You have to balance these things, because the more dead material on it, the more kind of habitat and food sources you might leave for birds and insects, but also the more dead material is more of a fire hazard. So what is your risk situation? Lastly, oh yeah, there's also Encelia farinosa, another example of some deadheading. You can remove those seed heads or just leave them because of the client's preferences. So again, this would just be seeds for birds potentially. And also, if you want maybe to remove, maybe aesthetically you don't like the look of the dead seed heads, but you want to still leave food for birds, you can just clip them out when they're dry like this, and then just leave them in place as kind of natural mulch. And then towies and whatnot can go scratching around finding the seeds. So you don't have to pick one or the other. You can also just clip them and let them dry on the ground. There is mowing, which you guys probably are pretty familiar with, I guess. Just using a lawnmower to mow down plants, which, as you probably know, mostly we use with grasses, but we can do it with epilobium and achillea. And those ones really respond well to it, or respond to mowing because of they grow rhizomatous, like by rhizomes. So that's kind of those lateral stems. And so they can handle being mowed. Not a lot of our native plants like mowing outside of the grasses, but epilobium and achillea can handle that. And of course, when you're mowing, it's just going to create that manicured look, of like a lawn. So if that's what you're going for, if that's what you're going for, then you might want to utilize this technique. There is, I think, a photo of achillea. No, this is epilobium, which is California fuchsia. And of course, it's not flowering or anything, but you can see it's been mowed here, and it will come back in a few weeks with new vegetative growth. So it does respond to mowing, and you can see it's cut back pretty short. And they just, actually, I think this one was a string trimmer. Yeah, so like a string line trimmer, which similar technique, which is just mowing across the surface of the plant. It says you can mow or coppice. So coppicing, kind of the same thing. We're not really using the term super rigidly, because coppicing, I believe, refers to woody perennials only, but it's a similar technique. We'll get to it. But essentially, yes, you can use this technique with epilobium. Here, there's a grass type. So if you're mowing for lawns, like as a lawn substitute, you will have to mow sort of more regularly like you would with a lawn. But if you are mowing a bunch grass, you'll mow it more seasonally. So you won't be mowing it regularly, you'll be mowing it in a more seasonal fashion. And that's going to depend, the season depends on what type of grass you're mowing. So cool season, there's cool season and warm season grasses. And basically, when we say it's a cool or warm season grass, that just is referring to its growing season. So a cool season grass grows and does most of its growing in the cool season, and a warm season grass does most of its green growing in the warm season. So when you mow it, you want to mow it like right before it starts its season, is how I would think of it. So a cool season grass, you're going to do it sometime in the fall, because it's right before it gets cold winter and when it's during its cool season. So you would mow it back in the fall. And a warm season grass, you would do like late winter, spring, right before it starts to warm up again. And then basically you mow it back with all the dry, like kind of material, and then it has it starts its new season with a nice fresh haircut, and then it can sprout out and look green. And that's what's happening in these photos here. This is the Elmas Canyon Prince, which is a cool season grass. And you can see it looks all floppy and shabby. It has quite a bit of dry material. And It's much bluer in color, which the Elmuses, the wild rye, they turn blue when with the higher temperatures. So basically it's gone through all of summer and fall warm, and it's got that more blue color. And like I said, it's kind of dilapidated and, you know, floppy. So it's due for a mowing. And you can see here, it's been mowed. It's pretty short up close. You can see there's a little bit of new green growth already coming in. Even in this photo, you can see it. But you mow it back and then it comes back right in the cool season. So this was mowed back in fall, which makes sense. And then by winter time, it's already getting greened up again. So that's something you can do with the bunch grasses. Edging. Edging's just literally, like the word says, it's just kind of pruning any kind of ground cover back to the edge of a path or a hardscape, like a sidewalk or a street, just anytime you're kind of cleaning up the edge. And it's really just to kind of give it that neat appearance. And so your ground covers don't take over your sidewalk. And here you can see this is the Baccharis pilularis pigeon point. And this is more of a woody perennial. So with the woody perennials, you actually, well, let me go back. If it were not a woody perennial, like more like a Achillea millefolium, the yarrow, if it was yarrow, or maybe like a fragaria, the beach strawberries, these are like non-woody perennials. And so those ones you can actually just use like a string line trimmer and just like, you know, right on the edge, and they'll grow back and it looks fine. You don't want to do that with the more woody perennials. So this Baccharis, if we cut everything back to the same point, it actually ends up leaving like a kind of dead zone, because the plants respond by growing, but then they're all cut at the very exact same point. So what you do instead with these woody perennials is you like stagger your cuts into the body, the main body of the plant a little bit, and kind of to hide your cuts, and also to make it look like more natural. Like, see how it's kind of a more natural edge and not just like a really clean, hard line. So that's what you would do in those cases, is kind of stagger your cuts. Here's another one. This is Ceanothus Yankee Point. And you can see you can get a pretty clean line, but you want to be hiding your cuts, or here even, into the main body so that you actually don't create that dead zone look.
Claire, question.
Yeah.
Is it cutting those? Is that like cutting rosemary, where you have to actually have a little bit of growth on the stem that you're cutting in order for it to grow back, or is it, or can you?
Well, it depends. So if it's like yes and no, I guess. But yes, definitely you might want to be cutting into the, well, yes, it depends if you're trying to fill the space. So in this case, there's like, for example, this Ceanothus Yankee Point, it's pretty full. So I would probably be doing more like thinning cuts, which I'm about to get to, is like removing branches so that they're not coming out into this main area. But those cuts where you're cutting like fresh or new growth, like this year's growth, usually the response is some kind of growth back. So if there's enough space for that, yes, and you're doing regular pruning in that spot, yes. But if it's something like a really long branch that's taking over the pathway, then I would maybe do a full cut to the origin. But yes, I guess I think it's more, I can imagine situations for both, but definitely, yeah, it definitely depends, I guess, is the best way to put it. But if you are wanting that response with some green growth, then I would say you do the cut into the new like 1-year-old fresh growth. Okay, then there's thinning, which I was just referring to, thinning or lifting. So thinning cuts are when you, this is also called, I believe, in some books, selective pruning, and maybe even in one of your data sheets that we're going to go over. But thinning, lifting is just removing, essentially the whole branch or the whole stem back to its point of origin. So you're eliminating an entire branch, and you're not cutting, into it. You're just removing it back to its point of origin. And this makes sense, especially if you're removing like the 4 Ds I was talking about, like any of the disease, damaged, dead, or disoriented branches. You will want to thin them out probably completely to their point of origin. Also, you can use this technique though for opening up the structure to like allow more air circulation, or like the example that's mentioned here is in manzanitas, to get that kind of really highlight that structure and form of a manzanita tree, you want to thin out the extra branches that are like dead wood, or maybe take away from that look. So it could potentially be used for aesthetics and shaping also, but also potentially health reasons too, to keep that airflow or bring more light into the canopy, or yeah, I said removing dead material for aesthetics. And yeah, so definitely can be used for shaping. Manzanitas, I mean, a lot of plants will respond to this, but a lot of the woody ones is where you might be thinking about it. And I also kind of think of this as more of an activity with a more mature plant. Like, you're not doing as much thinning in the first year or two, unless there is a reason. But typically you're starting to think about the structure and aesthetics as the plant gets a bit older. But if there's damage early on, you might have to use this technique still. Oh, wait, yes, this little slide. I just wanted to add, in terms of techniques when you are pruning, you want to make sure that you keep the branch collar intact, which is this branch collar and the bark ridge, which is kind of like equivalent to like the shoulder and the armpit of the branch. So when you're thinning, you're removing the whole branch from back to its origin, but you want to make sure you leave this kind of armpity shoulder zone intact. It makes for a cleaner and smaller wound and cut, so it's easier for the tree or plant to respond and callus and heal over quickly. Also, a lot of the cells that are responsible for healing and like wound, what is the word I'm thinking of? Like wound healing actually reside in this zone of the trees. So it's important to leave that intact. If you're removing a limb that is much larger than your pruners can handle, you want to use like a pruning saw. And we actually encourage that 3-cut method, which is like you do this first kind of undercut about a couple inches out from wherever your final cut is going to be. And then you do a second cut outside of that undercut, and that will basically remove the main weight of the branch. So if it's a heavy branch loaded with a bunch of leaves or branches or twigs and things, you want to make this cut here, and then the main weight of the branch falls away. And then you'll be left with this stump. And then you can do your final 3rd cut. And that's to avoid potential ripping or tearing, which is if I were to just start cutting here first and not do the 3-cut method, maybe when I get to about this point, the weight of the tree will just pull and actually just snag and rip this whole armpit area, which would I should say branch collar, I guess. Nobody wants to hear armpit area. But this would basically, you'd basically be creating a bigger and larger wound, which is a lot harder for the tree to heal from, and open to infection and disease and fungi and all the things. So definitely want to implement this when it's a larger branch. And the whole point is this undercut basically ensures that if it breaks or rips, you've created this automatic weak point, so that if it starts tearing, it's just going to stop here. So you don't risk the rest of the tree and the branch collar area. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing thinning cuts on larger limbs. Here's a thinning cut on a not large limb. It's just a little kind of spindly stem, but that is still considered a thinning cut. But you can see there's a dead kind of stems or stem here. Potentially, I think this is just one stem with the laterals coming off of it. And simply that, it's just removing this out. You just remove it out back to its origin, and you can see it just looks exactly the same without the dead piece. And so that's exactly what thinning is.
Can I ask a quick question related to that? Do you recommend always sanitizing your pruners or tools when you change plants or individuals?
Yes, but I know in reality, we'll talk about that with tools a little bit later, but yes, especially when working with diseased material, I would say absolutely between plants. And that is kind of the best practices. They tell you to do it between plants. But of course, in reality, especially if you're doing many, it's a lot harder. So I would say definitely if you're working with diseased plants, prioritize cleaning even between cuts. If your tree is not diseased all over, you might not want to spread it, but definitely between plants within diseased ones. And yeah, ideally, if you can and you have the time to cut to clean your pruners between cuts, I definitely, that's the best practices, but I do know it's hard to do. I would definitely say if you don't have the time, prioritize the diseased, cuts, cleaning between diseased cuts, and also between sites. So if you're going to another garden, you definitely want to make sure you're cleaning your tools before you get to the next one, so you're not spreading it all over town. So yeah, definitely want to be cleaning between cuts, but I do know, like, in practice, I can't say I always do that. But I do with the disease stuff for sure. Yes. Okay, so we have got we're still on thinning and lifting, right? So this is Melosma laurina, which is the laurel sumac. And you can see here, well, it's actually kind of hard to tell what's going on until you see the after, but essentially there's a lot of branches coming out at the camera, and these have just been removed completely back to their origin, which is the ground, essentially, because laurel sumac is more like a multi-trunked shrub. So these ones that are kind of coming out at the camera have been all removed back, and that's because it's making space for this this chaparral yucca, the Hesperal yucca whipplei. And you can see it's there. It's been done basically to make space. So again, the thinning can be for health reasons, or just for pruning for overcrowding, or to make space or airflow for all the neighboring plants. And you can see that's what's happened here. It's just basically cleared out these branches for more space for the neighboring plant. I think I have one more on thinning. What is this? Oh, this is elderberry. So the sambucus, which is, you can't really, again, hard to tell, but you can tell more if you kind of orient yourself with the pathway. You can see the pathway is a lot more visible in the second photo. And basically there's a lot of stuff dangling down here. And so again, that would be a reason for pruning, would be just clearing the pathways and keeping them clear for movement. And so here there's some branches dangling, and this is kind of like where the lifting comes in. So again, it's called thinning or lifting, but essentially when you remove some of the lower branches, which I bet this actually kind of connects somewhere down here, even though it's very hard to see on 2 dimensions, but essentially removing these lower limbs is kind of like lifting the canopy of the tree. So that's another thinning method. So they probably remove this whole branch out, or stem, whatever, this one that's kind of shading over in the front. And that like effectively lifts the canopy so that, there's more space underneath, as you can see in the second photo.
Yeah, I have an elderberry that that's actually growing pretty wild, and it's got these really long, slender, and I'm just wondering whether we could just cut them, slower, because it's in a school garden, so the kids will be, taking some of the fruit. So, but just when I take it down, it would just bush out, right? Is that
Right.
what will happen? Okay.
Yeah, they kind of have that form that's like almost like weepy, long, kind of straggly legs.
Mhm.
But you could potentially thin out, like, to make it a little bit more of like a wider umbrella and less of like a kind of crazy shrub, the way they kind of naturally look, by thinning out and lifting it, because you'll still have the inner stems that will kind of still do that same feature, but maybe you'll just have less of it and more space under the canopy, and then the kids can be more on the outside of it, as opposed to like all kind of, because it is kind of like a shrub almost, and it can be really unruly. So yeah, you can just kind of like carve out the underside. But that it is naturally very kind of unruly growth like that. Okay, there is tip pinching, which is, or pinching or tip pinching, kind of both of those terms are used. This is when you're removing just the tip of the stem when new growth is coming on, or right after they flowered. So this is definitely on that fresh new growth. And here is like a salvia, you can see, and you're basically just pinching it back to the next set of buds or leaves or whatever, because essentially what the response will be is that where you tip pinch, the buds, the falling buds below that point are going to respond with growth, and they're going to branch out. So like if I tip pinch this back to here, kind of where his or this person's thumb is, this will branch out here, branch out there, and this will all be branching out. So this method or tip pinching is used to kind of encourage that fuller growth instead of having this be like a big long stem that's loaded with weight. It actually kind of keeps it a bit more like a shrub, a more branching shrub. And this is really important to do with your salvias. I mean, actually, most of our native plants early on, so in that establishing phase, will really respond well with the tip pinching, because you kind of want all of your plants to get a bit more branched out, especially from when they come, you know, in their 1 gallon from the nursery. A lot of times it's just one stem or 1 or 2 or 3 in their gallon pot. And if you don't tip pinch that back and encourage more branching, what ends up happening a lot of times is those 2 or 3 stems in their first year or 2 in the ground, they just get really heavy with the weight of all the new growth. And you risk it like kind of splitting down the middle or breaking that whole branch off, because it's a lot of weight for kind of a small little crown. So you're actually kind of increasing the size of that base and crown and branching it out for, I would say this would be not just aesthetic, but for the health of the plant. So doing that tip pinching early on, especially with salvias, so we can avoid that crown splitting. But also many of our new natives will really appreciate tip pinching, and aesthetically it will really help with your plants. And again, this is just going to encourage, the response is fuller growth, because you can see when you tip pinch here, you're going to create like, you know, some growth in this direction, then that direction, this direction. So it really fills it out. So that would be this method. Okay, then there's reduction cuts or heading back. Let me see where I am on my little notes. So before I get into this jargonized kind of terminology, just understand that a reduction cut or a heading cut is basically just cutting a portion of the end of a branch. So you just have a branch, it's just cutting some portion of the end of it. That would be a reduction or heading cut. It's not a thinning cut, because a thinning cut would be cutting it back to its origin. And a reduction cut is just kind of, you're basically making a stump somewhere along the branch. So here it describes it as cutting a leader branch or a stem back to a lateral, which is the kind of side. The leader branch is like your dominant stem, or usually your trunk, but you could also refer to dominant limb on the tree, depends on the form. But the leader branch is usually the main dominant, largest, most robust stem on the stem or trunk on the tree. And you're cutting back to a lateral, which is usually a smaller twig or branch or stem coming off of some other limb. I know it sounds a lot more complicated than if you can see it, but this basically would be our leader. This is kind of the main trunk of the plant. And then all these little guys coming off are laterals. These are not as strong, they're not the dominant branch, they're coming off of another limb. So when you do a reduction or heading cut, again, you're cutting a portion of the branch back like this, or the leader. And you want to make sure when you do that, you cut it back to a lateral that is usually at least 1/3 of the size of that main leader branch, 1/3 or more in diameter. I guess I didn't say that. So yeah, in the thickness of the branch, you want it to be the lateral to be at least 1/3 of the size of the main branch. If you cut like a big old tree trunk that's like, 10 inches across to a little, finger stem, that's just way too much energy for that lateral to absorb in terms of regrowth, because the tree is going to respond with regrowth, but a little lateral cannot basically absorb that much energy. And so what you'll end up having is just like a bunch of water sprouts, kind of that effect, which you see a lot in the urban landscape when they just kind of top trees and stuff. You'll see a lot of those sprouts everywhere. That's when it's like you're cutting or heading back to a lateral that's too small for such a big main leader branch. So in this one, let me take a couple steps back. With a reduction or heading cut, this is typically something you're doing when you're shaping and you're really wanting to dictate the shape of a plant. And also So it's kind of falls into this category of shaping and aesthetics, but also it's something you're doing when the plant's more mature. It's usually, as you can see, this tree has got to be at least 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And when you're doing that, before you make reduction cuts or heading cuts, you want to keep in mind like the overall shape of the plant and the growth habit of the plant. So Prunus ilicifolia tend to grow kind of shrubby. You can make them into a tree form, but you need to be making it into a tree form from kind of day one. And this one looks like it's kind of a shrubby form. It looks like it does have a leader branch on it. But again, you want to look at the whole plant. Of course, it's hard because we don't have 3D here, but you want to take into account the shape of this overall plant. And like I said, also the way its growth habit, because that's going to help you determine where to make the cuts. And so when I kind of make the outline of this, the general shape of this plant goes all the way up to here, it's kind of like a lopsided Christmas tree right now. And if I want to make it more symmetrical, I would probably want to do a reduction cut to remove this kind of vigorous top part. And then these laterals below can absorb that regrowth and even everything below here. And you can see that's what's happened here. I know it's hard because the background's not like white, it's more vegetation. But if I show you with my mouse here, the general kind of shape is not as lopsided, it's a little more symmetrical. And the plant will respond with growth into these laterals and these lower branches. So that's the idea when you're doing a reduction or heading cut, is to kind of encourage that regrowth, because it is going to respond with growth because this is its leader branch. You want to make sure you're cutting it in a way to where its response will be growing in the way or in the area you want it to be. I have a more up close picture in case that was really confusing. So here's that same tree, but this is the actual cut. And you can see here's that leader branch. And you can see the diameter here is about 3 times as thick as these laterals that it's been cut to. So you can see there's also a lateral back here, and I believe one that came straight out the back. But all of these, the response that's going to happen now is the tree, because it's lost that top there, is now going to respond by thickening and strengthening these laterals and putting more energy into these lower laterals. And that is kind of what you want. This is what we wanted here. We don't want it to keep growing in that that vigorous kind of vertical growth kind of lopsided way. So this is a way to correct that. I want to see, creates thicker growth, not advisable in trees as this causes water spouts. Yeah, so it's not advisable on large trees, like because of their large diameter. If you're doing a reduction cut and there aren't appropriate sized laterals, again, you're going to have that water spout effect. Then there's coppicing. Coppicing would be basically just cutting any woody plant to the ground or within 6 inches of the ground. So it's truly kind of like starting over. You're taking an established plant essentially and cutting it all the way back to the ground. And this is definitely done to reinvigorate. So this is a rejuvenating cut. This is when the plant is getting kind of old and maybe not producing as much new green growth, and you want to have a fresh new look to it. Then that's when you would utilize coppicing. And it's going to do kind of what we just were talking about, which is the tree is going to kind of respond with that water spout effect, essentially. Like you've removed all the vegetation, so it's just going to sprout out with tons more vegetation. And this is just a little icon thing that I grabbed from the internet, so it's not totally relatable, but this is the idea: is you have kind of an established plant, cut it back down to stubs, and then it just starts shooting back up, and in a few years time it's going to be back to the same size. And you can use this again to just reinvigorate plants, or maybe like if you have like, I don't know, like some kind of shrub, like a toyon that you've somehow shaped into a tree, but you want it to be more of a shrub. If you want to start over in terms of the shape, you can also do that. Here, I guess this photo, yes, this is the Baccharis in the front and then the Salvia in the back, or the background, I guess. And these were coppice, so they were cut all the way back down to the ground in November of 2020. And then in March of 2021, this photo was taken. And you can see they're already got like new fresh growth, and they're just all filled out like little hedgehog shrubs. So a lot of our plants can take coppicing, and many won't respond well to it. But Baccharis is definitely one. some buckwheats, but not all of them for sure. And cerces, which is the Western redbud, Matalia poppy definitely responds to it. Many of our manzanitas. But again, this is not something you're doing every year. You know, you're not coppicing a plant every single year. Well, actually, with the exception of Sphaerolaceae ambigua, which is the apricot mallow, or that one you can almost do every year. That's kind of a pruning style that they can handle, being essentially coppiced every other year or whatnot, and then they resprout. But most of our native plants can't recuperate within just a year's time to a coppicing. So you want to utilize this when you want to reinvigorate the plant. Let's see if there was any other notes I had about this. I had also chamise as an example, jojoba's, the green bark ceanothus has a burl on it, so it actually will respond to a coppicing, but most of the other ceanothuses don't really handle that so well. But yeah, essentially it's kind of mimicking a fire or some kind of like big event like a landslide. And you can see, if you've ever seen a area that's been burned, that's exactly how they respond. You're not cutting it, but you'll see that they just respond from down below, because you're basically, the top half has died. So it's a similar kind of, the effect is the same. Then there's shearing, which is just, you know, basically shearing or hedging is just making a hedge. And usually you do that by using shears, and you're, you know, just doing that a couple times a year, shearing the plant to get this kind of hedge look. And ideally you want the lower half to be a bit wider than the top half, so that it actually is receiving sunlight evenly, or at least getting sunlight on the bottom half of the plant. It looks like it's not in this case. It's a little bit, at least at the end here, it looks like the top half is a little bit wider. But the concern is that the wider it gets on top, the more you're shading this understory part, and then you might create this unintentional kind of dead zone down here. So if you want the hedge to be green all over, you need to make sure that it's getting light evenly all over. And definitely you want to be using sharp shears when you do that. It's important. And here on this one, also the Berberis nivinii, same. It's like pretty evenly getting sunlight all over. It looks like it's starting to get a little top heavy, and that might mean in a couple weeks or a month or so, you might have to hedge this back again. So you might do that 2 or 3 times a year. And yeah, just, it's essentially like you're doing a bunch of little cuts all over the plant, and the plant is responding with new growth. So it's like what we were just talking about. It's a bunch of, you know, essentially reduction cuts, and the plant is just responding with new fresh growth, because you can see the buds right below where you cut actually branch out and leaf out. So these are going to leaf out, this leaves out, this leaf out. This even look like these are starting to develop. And that's what's happening when you're doing a heading cut, but also when you're doing shearing, that's kind of happening all over. So that's, you can imagine if all of this leaves out, you keep that exterior green and yeah, green and leafed out. So here, yes, I think we have an example. Yeah, so lemonade berry is an example of a hedge that, or a native plant that responds to this kind of pruning. So you could do that. Here is a 75-year-old example. And then here on the right is LA byproducts, which is in Sun Valley near Theodore Payne. And from what I understand, they kind of almost unintentionally created these hedges. And essentially this is their driveway. And just, they planted these, what's it called? Buckwheats, these California buckwheats. And they, just to keep space and make space for the trucks and keep it clear of the driveway, they just would kind of hedge this back. And then it created these like hedges out of the Eriogonum fasciculatum. So it's kind of interesting because it's like such a strange form, but it just kind of shows you that, yeah, they will respond. And you can see they flower just on top like this. I don't know, these are so silly and funny looking, but yeah, that's an example of a hedge with a Eriogonum. And then there's espaliering, which is essentially when you're training a plant along a wall or fence, you know, some kind of more 2D kind of structure. And usually we're using this for planting in narrow spaces, maybe as a backdrop or something, but it is very heavy on training and pruning. So not all of our natives are big fans of this type of training situation. So some examples though would be flannel bush here, which is Fremontodendron, Some of the ceanothus can do pretty good with espaliering. Western redbud, the cerces, which definitely is kind of like almost like a fruit tree in the way that you can train it. And manzanitas too, because of that branching form, you can do it. Also, I was just talking about this with Lydia, but the grape, so our native grape, the vitis, is great for, grapes are notorious for being trained, that's why they made wine and stuff with it. So those are options for espaliering. Yeah, let's do a
Claire,
break. Yeah,
Claire,
okay.
I heard that the native grape is the base for all other grapes that are grown in California. Is that true?
I don't think that's totally true. I know they have mixed them, but definitely depends on, because it's like any agricultural thing where they have lots of different stocks.
Mhm.
And so not all of the grapes are, but there are definitely ones that use that. I believe Mission grape, which is kind of like the old grape they used. I don't know, the missionaries showed up with. They've crossed that one with it, and many of them have, but it's not all of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
But let's do a break. I can check out the chat, but let's come back at 6 and we'll kind of keep going with the pruning. And I'll just read through the chat while you guys are on break and answer any questions.
Claire, how are you?
Good. Oh yeah, Brenda's here. She's answering
I'm
everything.
here. Yeah,
Perfect.
it was pretty slow in chat. I just wanted to make sure that I got everyone on the excuse me, on the roll. I think I did. I have 15 out of 17, so that's everyone, not counting you and I.
Okay.
So I think I'm good. And
Nice.
the link is there for the
Oh, perfect. The Eventbrite for the.
Eventbrite. Yeah, it's not a public, so they can only access it if they have the link.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah. So
Yeah, actually, someone was asking last class if it's possible. I just told them to talk to you, so you maybe already got this email, but they were asking about if, say they missed the class this time around, could they potentially attend a class in the future of one of the landscaper certificate programs?
I don't know what to say. I mean, because theoretically it would be yes,
Mhm.
but they're not public. They're only for, well, the event can only be viewed by the
folks with the link. So
the
yeah,
folks,
it would be
yeah.
like, it would be a kind of a logistics nightmare to have a list of people that aren't in the
That
class,
missed
but
it.
yeah, totally.
But we have the same workshop available for and it's a fee-based class.
Yeah.
So they can take it. I think it's like $20. I don't know how much it is. It's
Yeah,
not,
I mentioned that in last
Yeah.
class too.
it's not that much, but it's
Yeah.
not free.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good point that to mention that the grapes and walnuts and stuff are usually hybridized for the drought resistance thing. I didn't
Yeah.
mention that, but yeah, that is why they would do that.
Mhm. Yeah, that one I got. I'm like, I know.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
I know. I don't know a lot, but I know grapes and walnuts.
Mhm.
Hey Claire, do you
Can
have
I
any?
ask
What was that?
sorry.
No, go ahead.
The native grape, like somebody told me that our native grape is already hybridized with non-native grape. Is that true?
Unless you think there is the Vitis, the Rogers Red, which they sell in the nursery, which is a mix between our native grape and like some kind of wine grape that I don't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, Rogers Red is the one that is hybridized on purpose because it has like this red foliage and it's been hybridized that way. But you can still find just the pure native one, so the Vitis californica, is it? Brenda, you'll know. Yeah, and that's the native grape. So you can still find that. It's not that they're do you mean in the wild or just in the nursery?
I don't know. I just heard word of mouth, so I don't really.
Either way, you can still find Vitis californica in which is a full native. It's not hybridized, and you can still find that in nursery.
So Natasha, a good rule of thumb is if the plant has a name like Rogers Red, Desperado, Oklahoma Blue, it's a hybrid.
Yeah.
It's not a straight species. Like a lot of the ceanothus, what's that popular one? What the guy's name?
Oh,
McMinn?
Mark McMinn. Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah, the
Mark
Howard
McMinn.
McMinn.
Howard McMinn.
That's the hybrid, but for the most part, Theodore Payne only sells California native plants that had been hybridized with other California native plants. So they're still native. So for example, the Palo Verde, we only have the straight species. We don't have the Desert Museum species because that's a hybrid between 2 California natives and an Arizona species. So that would make it not California native.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really common in the nursery industry to hybridize plants. And like Brenda said, sometimes they're just hybridizing 2 natives. That happens a lot with the sages. You know, there's a lot of like purple sage with this sage. And so they are all kind of heritage of native plants, but then also there are natives that are hybridized with non-natives, like she said, like the Desert Museum, Palo Verde. So it's, yeah, it depends on your goals for your garden. A lot of times the hybridized plants have some kind of benefit in terms of, yeah, like the might be better drought resistance or better with certain pests and diseases. A lot of times that's why they're doing it.
No thorns.
No thorn. Yeah, that's exactly thornless.
Yeah,
That's the Palo Verde.
thornless, or
sure.
they're, what do I say during my presentation? They're either hybridized for size, flowers, or growth pattern. Those are the biggest ones, right?
That's a good, I've never thought of like the organized way of putting that, but yeah, it's the size, flowers, or what was the last one?
Growth pattern.
Growth pattern, yeah. So it's like having a bigger one or smaller one or
a ground cover.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like
exactly.
there's one sage, it's a hybrid. Oh my God, the flowers look neon. I don't know what it is, but it's amazing.
Yeah.
And you can kind of tell that it is a hybrid just because the flowers are so bright.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You're like, that doesn't look
like, why is it standing out so much? Someone's gonna eat it.
Yeah. So good question though, Natasha. Wait, what time is it? Oh, it's 6:01. Okay, I'm back on. Okay, let's talk about seasons to prune. So this is a lot. I mean, a lot of this lecture is pretty generic, I guess, like, yeah, getting kind of general, and there's a lot of exceptions, like I was saying with the coppicing or whatnot, but even more so with seasons to prune. But most of it, well, first of all, like going back to the kind of point I was making, like, you want to have an objective in mind. So depending on the objective and depending on the plant you're pruning, that might impact what season to prune. Because if it's something like you want to do a rejuvenating cut, that might be during fall, whereas maybe tip pinching, where you want to just kind of get some more new growth and fuller growth, that might be something you do in the springtime. So it does depend, like you want to go back to like have the objective in mind, and what kind of plant are you dealing with, because that's going to definitely affect the season that you cut it. Also, just in general, like as a kind of banner statement, you want to avoid pruning in the nesting season, but the nesting season is really long. You know, the bird nesting season would be from like January to August. So you can't avoid that whole chunk of time, but especially during that time, especially like June, which would be like the peak, you want to be very cognizant of the fact that there might be nests around, and maybe avoid your tree pruning, or just being very aware of the fact that there might be birds nesting. And birds don't just nest in trees, they also nest in shrubs and even on the ground. So just that would be something, you know, generally you want to avoid disturbing nesting season, but it is hard to avoid completely. And then I kind of mentioned this earlier, but again, it's that kind of reminding yourself the fire hazard versus wildlife material and habitat material, kind of have that balance in mind based off of where your garden is located and what material you're working with. And I think before, trying to see if I have any more notes about this. Well, yeah, we'll just get into so this is just kind of, again, general for ground covers, but it's very much going to depend on the species that you're dealing with in terms of ground cover. But generally speaking, most of our shrubs kind of work with right after flowering, you can prune them, or prior to their vegetative growth. But that really depends, because not all of our plants flower and then do vegetative growth. Some do vegetative growth and then flower. So again, it's kind of knowing the habit of the plant and which plant you're talking about. But generally speaking, after they've flowered is a good time to prune, or right before they start putting on their new vegetative growth, which is like the green leaf growth and stem growth. So, and with edging with your ground cover, you can do that at any time of year because you're just cleaning up the path. Any kind of path cleanup you can do any time of year. That's not really affecting the overall plant. You're just doing the edges. So you can do that at any point. Conifers are kind of their own little category. Again, there's like, you could get really nuanced here, and there are manuals and stuff for all the nuance of the different categories. We've kind of lumped a lot together. But that being said, with conifers, they really need unobstructed space around them. They really don't like touching and rubbing on other plants, and they actually die back when they are rubbing on structures or other plants. So you want to keep that in mind with pruning any kind of conifers, or at least also with spacing them appropriately. But usually you want to do any shaping, which would be like controlling for size, maybe after the new needles have hardened off. And I don't know if you guys have ever, like, you know, pulled out those pine needles. They hardened off when it comes out with the sheath, you know, when you have the multiple, depending on the type of conifer, you have the multiple little pines and they have all connected by that little sheath. If you pull it out and there's no sheath on it, then the needles aren't hardened off yet. But controlling for size or doing any kind of shaping with a conifer, you would probably want to do after that point, because that's kind of after its vigorous growing season. And also, well, yeah. And so we have those, I'm trying to see if, oh, that's the one note I wanted to put, is with the conifers, you don't really want to cut into old wood, or if you are, don't expect any regrowth, because they're kind of an exception. They're really not going to do that water spout effect. So you don't want to do like a heading cut on a conifer if you're expecting some kind of regrowth there. You would do a heading, you would do cut into old wood if you're planning on removing that limb and you know you don't want it. So they won't really resprout from old wood. So that's something to keep in mind with them. And I think I'm just going to move ahead. I sometimes get kind of carried away, but there's a lot of slides. So this category is semi-evergreen species. This is basically plants that are evergreen all year long, except for under certain conditions. So some conditions they'll go dormant, which is usually like drought deciduous plants. So they go dormant when it's when they're not getting a lot of water, or you know, during the summertime. So we call those semi-evergreen. And so these ones you would prune during their period of slowest or no growth. So kind of figuring that that would maybe be their dormant season or not. If you're watering it, maybe it's the slower growing season, and that's when you would do your pruning. And it's going to be very different by species. Here's this example on the right. This is seep monkey flower. So this is like more of an annual inland, but as the name suggests, it grows in seeps and near waterways, and it will grow all year long in that condition. But in other conditions, it would be basically, yeah, considered semi-evergreen, because it would just go dormant if it didn't have access to water all year long. So these ones you could be, with the monkey flowers, like I was saying, you can deadhead them to keep the flowers going. But if you are going to do any pruning back, you would do that kind of like right before fall, sort of when there's not any flowers left on it, or there's still some green growth, but the flowers have mostly all gone away, or not gone away, but they're spent. So yeah, we have a bunch of different examples here of plants that can fall into this category. With the Massalia poppy, I said the shrubby monkey flowers. Encelia would be another one, because those are drought deciduous. Then there's this category, which is kind of like everybody else. It's a big category. So it's evergreens, herbaceous perennials, and shrubs. So that's like a giant category. And like I said, in other pruning manuals, they would actually separate these out. But generally speaking, these ones you would do any shaping. So like redirecting growth and stuff like that right after they've flowered, and do rejuvenating stuff like coppicing or whatever in the fall. So big rejuvenating cuts you would do in the fall, and shaping you would do right after they flower. There are exceptions though. So the exception would be for anything that's grown for its like showy fruit or seeds or something. And that's because if you shaped it right after flowering, one of those exceptions, then you would actually remove the flower and fruit. Sorry, yes, the flower and the fruit or the seed. So, I I'm sorry, not the flower, the fruit or the seed. So basically flowers, and then you get the fruit, and then you get the seed, right? That's like the progression. So if you shape and cut after it's flowered, you're potentially removing all of that potential fruit or potential seed. You're not letting them sit and mature on the plant. So you want to avoid that in these two examples, which are pictured. So the foreground one with the Western bluebird is the toyon. So that's the red fruit that we get around this time of year with toyons. And that is a, showy part of the plant. So if you were to shape this toyon after it flowers, which it usually flowers in sometime in summer, if I were to do some shaping cuts and do a bunch of cuts, I would miss out on the fruiting period because I would have removed all of those berries or the prior to berries. And then in the background, it's not the best photo, but that's Cercocarpus betuloides. And if you check out your, I don't have it with me, but the cards, your flash deck cards, it has a really nice picture of the way the seed heads look. They're here, the seed heads are not mature, but basically after this flowers, the seed heads then mature on the plant sometime, in summer, flowers like springish, and then the seed heads develop and they have these like wispy, cool, kind of feathery seed heads. So if I were to have pruned it after it flowered, like the rule suggests, shaping after flowering, then I would have missed out on the seed development. So there are exceptions. Toyon and Cercocarpus would be definitely exceptions to that if you, if you wanted to, follow this rule. And then there's a huge list of different examples of plants that fall into this category. So like coffeeberry, toyon, all of these still fall into this category. And you could still prune it during this time, but you would miss, like for example, the toyon, you could still prune it, but you are going to miss out on the berries. So if you have a client who's like, it's really important to me that I have bird food all year long, and I really like having the toyon berries for birds, then then that would matter more for that client. And that's where I wouldn't be shaping it after flowering. I'd wait till springtime or something. I think, did I have another? Oh, wait.
I have a question about the semi-evergreen. So like some of those plants that you have listed there, like I had heard that you should not cut back like in the summer or drought time because it's very stressful. It causes a lot of stress during that season when they don't get a lot of water.
Well,
or when it's like really hot.
Yeah, it's going to very much depend on the plant. If they're dormant already, that's usually not going to cause them stress because they are kind of like in a dormant period. If they're actively growing, but they are a plant that, like for example, if you had an Encelia that you're watering a bit extra in the summertime, so it doesn't experience its drought kind of deciduous dormant period, then it would be maybe kind of stressful to prune it because it's actively growing still. So these semi-evergreens are the ones that kind of can fall into each category. So that's why if you're watering it, you want to do it during its like lowest growth period, which would probably be in summertime, because basically it's growing all the rest of the year. And then if it's experiencing its dormant period, then that shouldn't be very stressful because the plant is kind of like shut down a bit, so I would, that's kind of how you would, but it does depend on the species. Sorry, I don't really answer it, but it kind of gives you some, because there are some plants, like you said, that would be very stressful for them to be. I'm trying to think if there were any examples on that slide that it would be stressful during the summer. Maybe the monkey flowers, if they were being watered and like they had green growth on them. But again, you also, when you pruning, you want to maybe avoid the hottest day of the year for pruning, unless maybe you're pruning out deadwood. Man, I'm getting myself into like unless, but yeah, there really with pruning, there's a lot of exceptions, and it's hard to kind of put these all into like simple categories like these slides suggest, but we're trying anyway. Here's an example. We're still in the kind of evergreens, herbaceous perennials and shrubs. And this is just on the left and right. These are both salvias, Cleveland sages, and one on the left has been pruned back. So basically headed back entirely or done a bunch of reduction cuts all over it. Again, this was November 2020, and this picture is taken in March 2021. And the one on the right was not headed back. So it's just left. So you don't have to, like I was saying, you don't have to do all the pruning cuts all the time on all the plants. You can choose not to. It's always about what's your objective? So if my objective was that I want to rejuvenate the plant on the left because it was getting too big and unruly and I wanted to have fresh new growth, then I achieved it because by March of 2021, you can see it's got all this fresh new green growth. And you can see on the right, there's maybe not a lot of new growth on it, but it's still very big and lush and has, you know, all the dried seed heads. And this is just two options. So it's really, there's no yes, right or wrong answer. It's just kind of like, what was the objective? And for example, like if I had a garden that was for wildlife and you know, bird habitat, which one would I pick? The one on the left or the right for being appropriate for like a wildlife garden? And you guys can unmute yourself or answer, but which one? Yeah, and why is that?
Because of all the seeds that are there for the birds and places for them to go. And
yeah, there's plenty of places underneath to hide and all sorts of things like that. So yeah, this is exactly how you would have to approach it. Is like, what is the goal here? If it's to keep a lot of wildlife habitat and all sorts of space for critters to hide and seeds for them to eat, then I want to go with the right hand one. Or maybe it's like a process of like slowly rejuvenating the garden. So you rejuvenate one, but leave the other. So there's still space, you know, still wildlife habitat, and not rejuvenate everybody all at once, because then you have a lot of exposed land or soil and not a lot of, you know, seed heads and stuff around. So that's definitely just kind of keeping both those things in mind.
and the one on the left, when it says it was headed back entirely, so that was cut all the way down?
You know, headed back entirely would mean that you cut a portion of the stems back, all of the stems back in November. It's not coppice,
Okay.
so it wasn't cut all the way back to the ground, but usually with the salvia, especially Cleveland sage, you could like actually cut it back about 50%, but most salvias, about a third, you can take them back. So this was probably, yeah, headed back, like say if it was this size, it's probably just taken back about here. So it's about a third. And then you can see there's new responding dense kind of growth coming back.
Okay.
But yeah, different than coppicing. Thank you for clarifying with that question. I kind of also hate this category, but but again, this is flowering perennials. So this is more for plants that are flowering, have a longer season of flowering. So they are, if you were to wait until they stop flowering, you wouldn't ever really have a chance to prune them. So in those cases, when you have plants that are flowering most of the year, then you would have to, you usually do it after that first flush of flowers. So of course, they're going to get more flowering throughout the year. But like, for example, gambelias or something, they flower, they kind of have their first flush, and then you still have flowering, but it's a little less than that first phase. So after that first flush, that's when you would do your pruning. But this is the reason I don't like this category is because it is really dependent on the location. If it's inland, coastal, really SoCal, more Central California, what's the species, all the things.
Can't.
Oh, Elise, I think there you go. Thanks. So yeah, so this one is not my favorite category because it does kind of can be a little bit confusing if you try to apply this in all situations. But something like the bush poppy, yeah, definitely can kind of flower all year long. But after that initial flowering, you could do some pruning. Penstemons, California fuchsia is kind of, I guess though, I feel like it depends on the goal. If you're pruning the fuchsia to get some shaping involved, which you typically don't do, then yes, after their first flush of flowers. But usually with the California fuchsia, we're doing it, you know, around New Year's, you're coppicing it back to the ground. But typically, like you might have a couple of flowers on it still, so I could see that this rule still applying to it. But again, not my favorite category. I think, oh yeah. So these are like what not to do. Making excessive heading cuts. So having to cut back into the plant a lot and frequently, this is usually a sign you have something that's too big for the space. If you're having to repeatedly go back and do a lot of heading cuts and cut back this plant, or like shearing of it like more than 2 or 3 times a year, that's probably a plant that's too big for the space. You need to pick the right plant for the right space. And also doing multiple rounds of heading cuts, you're actually exhausting the plant's energy if you do it too often. So they have to respond with growth. And if you're doing that 7 times a year, you're really exhausting the plant's resources. So you don't want to be doing excessive heading cuts. And also don't want to prune right before it flowers, because right before it flowers, you're actually going to remove all of the flowers off. So they have all their flower buds. And if you prune it right before the flowering season, you risk cutting off all the flowers, which has happened here to this ceanothus. You can see there's some flowers here on the left, but it was basically sheared all over on the side right before it flowered. So the only flowers that actually made it were these ones on the edge, which is a bummer because ceanothus have a flowering season. They only flower that one time. So this is not going to flower for the rest of the year, not going to flower until the next year. So you got these little flowers. So it's not just for aesthetics, but all the pollinators miss out and everything like that too. So yeah, that's, then there's also, I said this already, repeatedly pruning for size control. That's just, again, exhausting the plant's resources. And so this one is probably too big. You can't really see, this was actually very wet around the plant. And that's why we suspect that it's overwatered, but also there's some dieback happening. You can see all this dead bits and edges that alongside with the clue that it was very wet around this plant is why you might consider it being overwatered, why it's said there in the slide. And then here is a Cleveland sage. You can see similarly, with no real intention around the pruning, and it's just kind of turned in this not too attractive plant. Also, this is potentially the wrong plant for the wrong space. Maybe it's very large. Cleveland sage can get 6 feet across. They can get very large. So these two have been pruned excessively to kind of control for their size and just kind of in this haphazard way. And so, yeah, it looks like this column and it's not very attractive. And not only not attractive, but you can see these are very dense. So it's almost being just hedged around the outside. So there's really no airflow into this inside. And I'm sure inside here is just maybe not dank, but not the best conditions for airflow and air circulation. Okay, I have a poll. Oops, Lydia, I forgot to tell you, but you can, you wanna, it's just poll, it's only one poll for class number 7. Sorry for the no heads up.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, should I launch it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to kind of, so yeah, this is just an example. I kind of already went over this in the lecture, but this is just review, I guess, then, which is just a client's express the importance of their native garden providing habitat and food for birds and wildlife. And they have this large 7-year-old toyon, which has a few unruly branches, and it's late summer and there are a bunch of spent flowers all over it. When do you think is I don't think it's on here, but when do you think is the best time to prune it is the rest of it? So would you prune it immediately, which is summertime, because we said it's late summer? Would you wait a couple months until fall, or do you wait until late winter or early spring to prune it? And it's a toyon, so you want to take everything into account, which is it's a toyon, and this person really values habitat and bird food and wildlife food and habitat. So
I don't get to vote, but I'll say winter and early spring.
okay. Oh, I have to vote. I guess I'll put your answer for.
Okay.
So
Should I end it now?
yeah, do you have most of the people in?
Almost.
Guys,
I have over 75%.
oh, okay, then let's do that. Let's see the results.
Share.
Yeah, so great. I'm glad most of you guys, I don't know if Lydia swayed your guys' votes, but yeah, the idea here, does anyone want to say why or why not they came up with their answer? Most of you guys said C, but why? What was the rationale?
Habitat.
Yeah.
It's a toyon, so it's going to have the fruit in the winter. Can't cut it in summer because it's nesting season. So wait until winter is almost over and it's doing its deadhead thing.
Exactly. And so this is that thing I was saying, it's the exception to that rule of shaping it right after it's flowered. Because if we did that, we wouldn't get any of the fruit that would come later in the season in the winter. And that would probably make the client really bummed because that's what they probably have the toy on for. And late winter, early spring is when the fruit is all on there, and you can, and you can prune it. And there shouldn't, you wouldn't be messing with the nesting season, like Brenda said. And also you get the benefits of the fruit there. And you can also prune the fruit and leave it on the ground if you really want to leave it all for the birds. But yeah, so that would be the thinking. And I could understand like that. That's why the B answer, which is wait a couple months until fall, is kind of like if you were doing the rejuvenating cuts. But again, it depends on this client, which is they really value the birds' habitat and food. So I would avoid it. Let me see my time. Okay, I'm going to skip this exercise since we did did that little poll and just move into tools. I'll kind of move through the tools quickly. Essentially, well, I'll just first of all, keep your tools sharp. This is really important because the sharper your tools are, the cleaner the cut you'll make. And the duller they are, the more likely you're actually crushing and not doing as much cutting. You're doing more crushing, and then you're like damaging more of the cells around the cut, which means it's going to be slower to heal because you're actually doing more damage to the surrounding area. So sharp tools mean like a nice clean cut, and you're only injuring like, a specific area. So that allows the plant to like callus and heal over more quickly. So sharp tools is important, not just for your safety, but also for the actual best practices for the plants. Obviously, this should go without saying, but using tools safely. Don't be using those telescopic pruners like near electrical lines and things like that. Like, this should go without saying. But we do want to emphasize using hand tools over power tools. Of course, in certain situations, it doesn't make sense feasibly to do that. But as much as you can use hand tools, use them, because it really lets you observe the plants like real up front and up close. And that's going to help you with IPM stuff. So pest management, really seeing the plants, and also, of course, actually pruning them. When you're actually visually seeing the whole plant and how its growth habit is, it can help you prune it to a more aesthetically pleasing shape, but also for investigating the pests and just how the plants are overall. And of course, it's good for like our hearing, but also for like the kind of habitat dwellers in the area. Power tools are going to scare them away, and that's not the kind of goal with the native plants, right? Usually there is some kind of wildlife habitat plus to them. So we want to keep it that way as much as possible. And then, as was mentioned earlier, hygiene is really important with California natives. We talked about that in the class about how there's lots of diseases that are contagious and can spread in the soil, or even from your pruners. So you want to make sure that you are cleaning your prunes between cuts, especially when you're doing disease material, like I mentioned. And you can use bleach, like do basically that 9 parts to 1, 9 to 1 solution or dilution of bleach and water. But bleach does corrode and oxidize your tools over time. So not good for like long-term care of your tools. You can use Lysol or any kind of, you're basically sterilizing them. So you could use rubbing alcohol and like a torch even, you can, I guess that's not like fire safety, but if you're in a not fire prone area, that might be an option. But definitely cleaning between sites, your tools is important, like I mentioned. And even like your shovels and all the things you're using, because those can carry soil pathogens and stuff. So between sites, I would recommend it, and between cuts with diseased material. And really, truly, the best practices is between all cuts, but it is probably hard to do that logistically if you're pruning a lot of plants. Okay, now there's a bunch of slides on different tools. I'm gonna kind of just touch on the ones, because there's literally like 20, and I don't want to go over all of them. We don't have time, but I'm just going to go over the ones that are mainly for pruning, and then like maybe some of my favorites. But of course, the bypass pruners are those here on the left. These are just your hand, shears or hand pruners. Sorry, not shears, your pruners. And these are going to be for any branch that's like, less than 1/4 inch in diameter. This is just anything you can prune with your hand. It's really important to have bypass pruners, which is kind of the scissor style, because it's basically 2 blades that bypass each other. And those are going to have the cleaner cut, as opposed to, you might have seen those anvil pruners, which is sort of like a blade that hits a stopper. It's more like a knife on a cutting board. So avoid those anvil pruners unless you're using them for like dead wood. But the anvil pruners are more likely to be crushing the plant cells and plant material. So the bypass pruners are really for the cleanest cut. The hedging shears, always want those sharp. That's just for making hedges, essentially. The loppers are for anything that's basically, up to 3/4 inch in diameter. So something you can't cut with your bypass pruners, but can fit with the loppers. And then of course, a pruning saw or a hand saw. This looks very tiny all by itself like this. And it looks like a little, butter knife or something, or like little kitchen steak knife, but it's, you guys probably have seen the pruning saws that are kind of have this curved blade. So that's going to be for anything, any branch, pruning any branch that's much larger than what your loppers can handle. So your hand saw is really helpful. These are just the telescopic ones. So the long arm pruners for far away, hard to reach branches. Pole saw and pruner. So it has like kind of the lopper function on there, and then the saw. I'm just going to move through these. Well, the collinear I mentioned in the weeding class, this one in the middle is a collinear hoe. This is what I was referring to if you want to do really shallow weeding of like small germinating plants, because these ones on the outside, the hula and the standard hoe, end up kind of bringing up more weed seeds than you want, because they are truly kind of like disturbing more soil. So the collinear hoe, if you can get it, or if you had to choose. Rakes, you guys should know. I like the trenching shovel for planting out. It's like you can get that depth and it's perfect for 1 gallons. So you can get that leverage and get the soil out. It's a lot easier to do plant outs with trenching shovels than with the spade, because you just have a nice skinny spade there, or shovel. These ones you guys should know. Hori-horis, if you don't know these ones, they're great kind of all around tool. Yeah, I think these are great for all sorts of garden activities, but I'm not going to really spend too much time. I'm just going to skip all of these. This is a good one to know. This is the kind of nursery standard for native plants, the Dram watering nozzle. It's that little red, this is the watering nozzle and this is the wand. This is the standard in the nursery industry, because it has like a really even watering, and it has this showering that's very gentle, even watering. So that's a good one. Okay, I think, let's see, I only have so much time. So let's get into, I really want to highlight this native plant maintenance data sheet that you guys have, and it's in your workbook. But essentially, I'll kind of work with this, I guess, slide, and then we can look at the data sheet, because I think okay. So manzanitas, again, so it's really, you think about what's my reason for pruning. It could be a lot of different reasons, but potentially, especially with the manzanita and that tree form, you might be pruning for aesthetics, to shape it, to grow in a certain tree form, or to reveal those branches. And you might do that with thinning cuts, or tip pinching to make it dense and more shrubby, if that's what you want, or reduction cuts to direct the growth in a certain area, or certain area. So the season to do that would be early spring usually. And the thing is with the manzanitas is they kind of have that iconic twisty branching habit that's not like a straight line, because of this feature of where they have this growth, they have their green vegetative growth that is basically terminated by the next year's flower buds. So what happens is the weather cools down, and they start flowering, and they set their berries, and then they start growing vegetatively. So they're doing, that's the process, that's the progression. And then they stop growing vegetatively, and that's terminated with these little buds. They're not flowers, they're flower buds. And they're the flower buds for the following year. And that flower buds are usually set sometime in summer. So it's vegetatively growing before that. And of course, before that, it's actually flowering for the year and fruiting and setting its fruit. So you want to actually prune or do your reduction cuts or anything like that sometime in early spring after it's flowered, but like during its vegetative growth phase, but before it sets that bud. So that's what you're looking for, that period. And oh, I didn't mention this, but essentially that iconic form that it has is because it terminates its growth there with the flower buds. And then the next year when it wakes up again and it, the season, it starts all over again with its flowers, those flower buds start on, the flower buds flower and sets its fruits again, and then it grows on a different line. So that's why it kind of has this kind of like crooked growing pattern, because it never follows on the same line. The flower buds stop it and it moves to the next, kind of moves in a different direction. So it's really important if you're trying to do some kind of like reduction cut where you are wanting some growth response, because reduction cuts are to strengthen the laterals or to direct the growth in some way. The reduction cut I want to do sometime in early spring in that little window where it's got its vegetative growth, because it's going to encourage the growth to go wherever you direct it. Whereas if I'm doing like a thinning cut where I want to just remove the dead wood, because a lot of times on those manzanita trees, you got a bunch of little twigs and dead wood stems that are not producing any flowers or vegetative growth. If I'm doing those cuts, that would be a thinning cut. Like I'm removing back the whole branch to its origin because it's dead. And in those cases, I might do it in summertime. I would rather do it in summertime because it's hot and dry. And it doesn't matter what happens with the flowers because no flowers are coming off of that branch that I'm removing entirely. So that's, again, like, this is what you want to keep in mind. There's not really like, okay, manzanitas, I always prune them in this time of year. It definitely depends on the activity you're doing or the goal you have in mind. So let's see if there was something else I was going to say about that. Yeah, well, that being said, I'm gonna try to share I'm gonna stop share, and then I'm gonna share the other document, which is your student workbook. Okay, so I wanna, just because that slide isn't super helpful if you don't have it with you, and but just so we can show you where your resources are, which is, here is, I want to be on page 114. This is in your student workbook. I'm going to start here on page 114. And basically, you have 4 pages of, so this is like essentially a data sheet of all the different native plants and a bunch of different columns with lots of super valuable information. And each column, each row it's basically an Excel sheet. So each row has 4 pages to it because it's essentially printed out. So 113 and the next following 4 pages all refer to the same plants here. So for example, Arctostaphylos, I just want to bring you to the description that's in your student handbook here of Manzanita. Is here it says thin branches to create open look or tip frequently in years 1 through 5 for a dense hedge. So that's like your motivation. Am I creating an open look or am I trying to get a dense hedge? And then it says manzanitas periodically get galls in summertime, which typically fall off by themselves by fall. So it mentions like potential pest issue that it has. By summer, manzanitas have usually already set buds for next year's winter flowers. So time your pruning for spring. So that was what I was just trying to explain. But again, you have this resource in case you forget. You always can just look back, like when is the good time to do this? And then it says small dead twigs are common and should be removed in early summer to improve appearance. Again, summertime for the dry dead wood, because it doesn't matter about the flowers being lost because there are none. And then disinfect shears between cuts if pruning off dead or diseased wood. And that's really important with manzanitas because they are susceptible to different root rots and things like that, and rots that are carried in the plant tissue. I just want to kind of highlight some more of this great, what's this called? Archive, because other columns aren't just for pruning. They really are helpful about all the kind of topics we've covered. So you can see, it says the pruning season could be spring or summer. We kind of talked about this. Tells you if it's evergreen or not, which manzanita is. Summer dormant, winter dormant. It says this was checked off. Go to the next page, which here's Arctostaphylos continued. This is great. It says if it works well with the LADWP irrigation regulations, which is that 3 times a week, no more than 15 minutes with your sprinkler or whatever. I can't remember it exactly. Depends. I think 8 minutes and 15 for drips or something. And so Arctostaphylos doesn't really work well with that. They don't really want that summer watering. It tells you if the plant is a preferred plant for swales. So that would help you identify if it's good for kind of rain gardens and that ephemeral like flooding potentially. So Arctostaphylos is not going to like that, but this is really helpful for if you look at the other plants on this list. And then it tells you the preferred mulch type, which a lot of people ask, like, what's the best mulch? And it says either organic or inorganic, so rocks or wood mulch. And then it has this replacement value interval. So this is either the interval at which you would plant a new one or potentially coppice it if it can handle coppicing. So Arctostaphylos doesn't do so hot with coppicing. Some of them do, I guess, like an Eastwood manzanita, but not all of them like it. So this is kind of the interval you can consider that you would have to replace them. Of course, they may live longer or shorter than this, but this is how you might plan your garden maintenance around, schedule around. And then has these things like difficult to establish, which yes, for Arctostaphylos, because it's kind of sensitive to summer watering, flowering season, the summer water needs, which is low, medium, high. And then here we get into finally like the common pruning techniques or pruning methods that you use for this plant. And you can see Arctostaphylos has early tip pinching, which makes sense for any kind of hedge type, bushy type ones. Thinning, which makes sense with the deadwood. Deadheading, not really common because you aren't going to be deadheading those flowers off. That won't elongate the season. We go to the next page. Here's manzanita again. Directional or formal pruning, which is another way to say heading cuts and reduction cuts. So definitely in this category. Hedging, also coppicing, not very common in manzanitas, so it's not checked. Raising is sort of like the lifting and the selective cutting, but raising is so that basically stubbing out the lower branches of a tree to kind of make the canopy higher and keep the lower branches from being over vigorous. And mowing doesn't really take mowing. And then you have like basically a bunch of different columns for the most common pests you see with this plant. So you'll see ants and root rot and branch dieback. That's common with the manzanitas. And then the last page of it, you can see powdery mildew, all these mildews, and it's also checked for sudden oak death. So this is super helpful for your, I'm gonna go back to my, yes, hold on, sorry guys, I'm trying to do this. Okay, go back to the slideshow, but yeah, I just wanted to show you that resource because it's super helpful for just if you don't remember all this information and just like a kind of going back to guide. And usually in the description box alone, it tells you the most key things to remember, especially if the pruning is very specific or there's some pest issues that are really common. Ceanothus is another one that I want to see actually if I have time for. I think I'll just move through this quick. But yeah, Ceanothus would just be, same exercise, which is like, what would you be doing this for? You might tip pinch to remove the old flower clusters, but you also might be using the Ceanothus as a hedge, so you might be shearing it. There's, you could be using multiple different type of pruning techniques. And it says not to cut into larger than a pencil thickness branch because of fungal infection. And if I go to this workbook again, which I'm not going to share on the screen because it makes me go back and forth too much, but you can see Ceanothus, it mentions similarly in the description, it says leaf drop is typical with the onset of first hard summer heat waves. So don't add extra water to combat this natural occurrence. And if anything, refrain from overwatering this chaparral shrub in summer. And then it says prune it in spring after blossoms to control size and increase lateral branching for a denser look if desired. So it really gives you the most important kind of tips for this thing, which is like, it's really susceptible to overwater in summer and sometimes has a reaction to the heat. by losing its leaves, but don't be fooled, and also the pruning tips. So lastly, I guess I'll just mention the sages, yes, which I was mentioning tip pinching, really important early on in the establishment of sages because we want to avoid that crown splitting. So that's definitely for the health of the plant. You want to do the tip pinching, and or you can do rejuvenation with the heading back, like we saw in that last slide where they were headed back about a third. With like Cleveland sages, you can head them back like a third to about 50%. Other sages like the purple sage and whatnot, usually it's standard about a third. You can head them back if you're doing that rejuvenating heading back cuts. And you can always tip pinch in those early years because that definitely will help. And I think, white sage though doesn't really need, I wouldn't do a lot of pruning with white sage. I would only prune out the large flower stalks that after they've flowered, that you can remove. But otherwise you shouldn't be doing a lot of pruning with white sage. And I believe your thing says the same in the, yeah, either way, you can check out your handout. I'm going to skip this slide because I don't have enough time.
There's one question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by crown splitting?
Crown splitting was what I was mentioning when I talked about tip pinching, which is when the plant has, especially happens in sages, if you don't, like if the new growth on the few stems it has, they get really heavy and overloaded with the weight of all the new growth, they actually kind of break off. So the whole arm will break off, or multiple, and it actually splits down the middle. And that's from the weight of all the new growth on the plant. So when we tip pinch, we basically kind of like redistribute that weight so that it's not just on one branch or three, it's on like multiple branches, and it's more dense and compact. So that's why you want to do that with the sages, because they do put on new growth pretty quickly. And so they can kind of overload with weight and just crack down the middle, or just even break a major limb, and then they're like lopsided kind of forever. So that's what I was referring to. I'm going to play this quick video from LADWP. This is like their kind of generic how to prune. All of this will be covered in the actually in-person workshop. But if any of you miss it, this I guess is like the poor substitute for that. But I'm just going to play this, and this is just kind of going over some of the actual specifics with pruning.
Plants that are appropriate to our climate and use less water will help your client save money. One of the most important things to remember while maintaining these beautiful, sustainable gardens is to properly prune the plants in the yard. Some people don't know that every cut makes a wound, and plants don't heal. They must seal over the wound. So you should always have a good reason for each cut. Remember, the first reason to prune or trim a plant is to keep it healthy. Here are some reasons you may want to remove a branch. When they're dead, look for branches with dead leaves or shriveled blackened buds. To check, scrape the bark to see if it's green underneath. If it's brown, you know the branch is dead. When there is disease, look for sunken areas that are oozing or discolored along branches or trunks. If they are, prune the diseased branch back to at least 6 inches below the diseased area into healthy wood if possible. When there is damage, if there are broken branches, make a clean cut to a bud on a young stem, to another branch, or remove the branch entirely. When they're deranged, this includes branches that are rubbing against each other or the trunk. You'll need to choose one to keep and prune the others out. Don't forget, never leave a stub. When this happens, the plants sprout weak branches called water sprouts, creating crowded branches, unhealthy plants, and more work for you. Here are some tips to avoid this. Remove whole branches all the way back to the bulge at the base of the branch. This prevents water sprouts and enables the plant to seal over the wound. If you must shorten a branch, prune it back to another branch that is at least 1/3 the thickness of the part being removed. On young 1-year-old branches, you can shorten them by cutting them to an outward-facing bud or back to another branch. Lastly, never prune trees or shrubs into balls or other shapes. This creates lots of stubs, lots of work, and is harmful to plants. This kind of thoughtful pruning maintenance will grow healthy, thriving plants. Thank you for maintaining sustainable gardens.
Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, so just the homework, lastly, this is last homework, which again, either or, because I just want you to get whatever works for you in terms of what would be more helpful. And the official one that's on your outline is sorting the flashcards. So the native plant flashcards that you guys got, sorting those into groups with similar pruning needs. So of course, there will be different ones, you know, depending on the species. But if it's like, okay, these ones will take coppicing, and, you know, categorizing that way. You don't have to do all the cards. You could just kind of make some categories of coppicing, hedging, all the different ones, and then sort your flashcards that way. You can just kind of make the lists, list it for me in your homework. And you can definitely, I would use that maintenance handout to help you with the sorting if you're not familiar. And, or just, you know, the notes on the card themselves. And then the second one, or not second, I should say, the other option of homework would be to assess a native plant and determine the best course of pruning given its condition. And if you want to do that, just you can send me a photo of the plant and tell me like, okay, this is what I'm seeing and this is what I'm considering doing and when. So like what type of cut you're going to make on it and when, and you know, your rationale maybe so that I understand what you're thinking. But either or, you can pick either one of these for your homework. And that's it for this class. I have 10 minutes so we can talk if there's any questions.
What is the or for the homework? I can't see it. It's like cut off.
Oh, is it? Okay. I'll just type it in the chat. Would that be easier? It's basically, I'll read it and then I'll type in the chat. But it's
Yeah, that's fine.
assess a native plant and determine the best course of pruning given its condition and aesthetic. So like I was saying, try to take a picture of it and explain to me what you're seeing and what type of pruning cut you would use and when you would do it based off of like, you know, the needs of the garden or the client's needs or whatever. I'm just typing this into the chat.
Okay, while you're typing, Claire.
Yeah.
Just want to tell everyone thank you for being here. We are receiving an award Wednesday from the Green Building Council for this program. So thank you for everyone for making that a success. It really is kind of innovative in what we're doing. Next week is the final Zoom class. Make a little time at the end of the class for a survey. That survey is helpful for us in order to make any improvements and or changes in upcoming programs. And I think that's all I have.
Hey,
Got it.
Claire, do you have
Yeah.
any suggestions for learning the genus and species of plants if you've never learned them before?
Yeah, I think, well, you know what was helpful for, I mean, I guess it depends how you learn, but I found, yeah, I'm like, Brenda, do you have suggestions about learning genus? I know you really like Latin.
Take my
roots and
class.
stuff. That's true. Brenda does have a great class.
Take
about
my
Latin
class.
roots.
So basically the way that I break it down is learn what the botanical name means. Asteraceae is star. So if it looks like a star, it's going to be some sort of a daisy, right? Arctostophilus, well, that means bear, so they don't look like bears, but they have the same, you know, kind of a shape. The rosacea, I don't know how to say that.
Rosacea. Yeah.
Rosacea, they all
Yeah.
have the jagged edges on the leaves. So it's just like finding one thing that you can remember that's an indicator and go with that. Honestly, this is going to sound terrible, but you don't need to know the name of the plant unless you're going to eat it, smoke it, inject it, or rub it on you. Otherwise, who cares?
That's true.
Yeah. What's the point? You know, you can just call it, oh, that yellow flower over there, you know, and that's it. But if you're going to do any of those other things, you need to know exactly what to tell emergency personnel when they show up. Right. Right?
Also, with identifying, this doesn't really necessarily help you memorize the genus so much, but starting to understand the families, or like, you know, all of the genus, like the Eriogonums. If you look at their flowers, the flower is usually how they identify plants, all plants, by their flower type. So I would suggest really starting to notice the similarities between flowers of the same genus.
Yeah,
So,
the aerial means wool, means fuzzy. So some part of that plant is going to be fuzzy.
yeah.
Right?
And so, and really all these, like, all the names come from these like Latin roots. So of
Not
course
all
having,
of them.
that's true. Thank you actually for clarifying.
What's that one?
But like
What,
she said,
Ramya?
knowing the like origin of the word and like breaking down the word can sometimes really give you some good clues. And some of them are easier than others. Like she was saying, arcto bear maybe isn't like the most obvious connection, but a lot of times you can kind of like work it back. But I use flowers for identifying plants. Not necessarily, it doesn't really help me with the genus, but to like get me in a ballpark a lot of times, to be like, okay, this looks like an Eriogonum, and then I'm like closer to. So I would start getting familiar with the flowers. You know, like the pea family has a type of flower, different families.
Yeah, they have the pods and the leaves are always compound.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So yeah,
So-
definitely I would start there. And then I would definitely take Brenda's class, because I know she like knows all about like the plant name origins. It's really like,
I don't know them, but I work with kids. So if I make it understandable for 5-year-olds,
Right.
then theoretically adults can understand as well.
Right.
But you know, for some of them, they're just what are some of the biggest classes? Asteraceae, Fabiaceae.
yeah, I would say Asteraceae is huge.
Asteraceae is huge. And just
It's like
think of that,
daisies,
it's a star.
sunflowers. That's like the huge kind of family.
Chrysanthemums, right? The other
Chrysanthemums
name,
is
it used to
big.
be called compostier. That means,
Oh,
you know,
composite. Yeah,
composite. So yeah, it's just flower on top of flower.
right.
So,
Yeah.
When do you teach your class and what is it?
So I'm in the works now of doing like what some of the name means. I don't go into genus. I just go into basic plant names that you're going to see in Los Angeles. And we don't have it on the schedule yet, but we're also working on another class in Spanish called Plantas para Pendejos, where we're going to start doing all of the plant parts in Spanish. Like the name for seedling is plantula. Like, oh, that's such a cool word. So yeah, you know, basic things like what's a tallo, what's a rama, what's a plantula, what is hoja compuesta. Yeah, that kind of stuff, because that is going to help you. If you can describe what you're looking at, you'll be able to key it out. You don't have to know all the plants. You just have to know opposite leaves, right? Alternate leaves, palmate leaves,
Right.
you know, like just describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it gets into like that's really how botanists do it. They just do it based off of all the, like they key out the flower, the leaves, and like all of that. So it gets into that world a bit, but yeah.
Thank you.
Take a botany class. California Native Plant Society has how to become a certified botanist. I don't know if you want to go that far, but they have the list with all the genus, species, with everything is on the list. I printed it and I just like learned one a day.
I know there's a book called Botany in a Day. Is like it doesn't work, and didn't work in a day for me, but it's great for the families, and it like helps you kind of learn them. It was my intro to kind of learning to identify flowers and things like that, and I found it really helpful. And it has like really clear pictures and then descriptions of what the different families and their different flowers. So that one I think is kind of helpful as a starting place if you're into books. I will stop my share now, and
Awesome.